So I work at Google at the Webmaster Relations team, and our goal is to help people build better websites. Because we know at Google it's a mutual partnership between us, the people who build content, the people who help people build content. And so we want to make sure that everybody knows how to build great content that's able to be indexed and searchable at Google. Today I want to talk about two big things, security and speed. In the context of speed, I'll be talking about AMP. How many people are aware of what AMP is? Just a quick show of hands. OK, pretty decent number. We're doing an OK job at marketing. And then I'm going to talk about security. And today, earlier this morning, we had a really great talk from Dre about security, so I'm just going to touch on a couple points. It's not going to be too long, but security is super important, as you all know, and I just want to touch on a couple points to make sure, kind of really drill that into your head. So let's first talk about creating fast sites. I'll start with an anecdote, because I was in Africa a couple weeks ago. I was on a family trip. It was a lot of fun. We were in Tanzania, and I sort of had mobile internet. But when you get into the Serengeti, this little patch here, it's mostly just plains and animals, right? Plains as in like, flat land. There wasn't a lot of internet. And elephants, they're super cool, but their ears, they don't really do anything for your mobile connection or your Wi-Fi connection. So when we were in the eco camps, there wasn't a lot of bandwidth to go around. We had maybe 10 people working off this small Huawei router that was trying to pick up a little bit of signal wherever it could. And there was a lot going on at that time in the US, obviously, with the election, with just sports, with basketball. The basketball season was starting, and I was just antsy to hear about all of it. And not being able to get any internet, having just limited bandwidth was really frustrating. But that actually brought a point into my head where it was like, I already struggle enough with the mobile web today, just on a really fast connection. Imagine people who are using slower connections, people who have phones that are older or worried about bandwidth costs. Like these problems that we see, slow loading, non-responsive content, and my personal bane of existence, content shifting, it makes the mobile web nearly unusable for a lot of people. And even today, it makes the mobile web unusable for myself. Just take an example like India. It's a really fast-growing mobile market. There's hundreds of millions of people there. But their bandwidth, or their mobile network is still lagging behind a little bit. And that means you're potentially missing out on a lot of people trying to get your content if the content can't load quickly on their device. And so we talk to a lot of people at Google. We interview people. We see like what they're looking for, what they want to do. A lot of people tell me, Eric, it's OK, though. I only design widgets for like the United States, let's say. So what I tell them is, look at these three numbers. This is the average mobile speed of 3 countries, according to Akamai's State of the Internet. I think this was Q1 of 2016. So obviously, with the way I'm framing this, the top one is not the US. That's actually the UK. So the UK is doing pretty good. The second one is actually not the US either. That's Kenya. The last one, 5.1 megabits per second, that's the US. And to just give kind of more context, the average speed right now globally is 7.5 megabits per second. So don't assume that your users are going to have fast speeds no matter where you are. These, again, are averages. So even if you're in the UK and you're assuming everybody has fast internet, there's a lot of people that don't have that type of access. And again, they're still looking for your content. So you could be missing out on a lot of people. Because if you're making these assumptions, you're going to lose a lot of visitors. Based off our study, 53% of people abandon a website that takes more than 3 seconds to load. And I don't know if you've ever tested your own website, but you can test your own website right now by going on your phone and seeing how long it takes. Try to test it on different types of mobile connections. Try to test it in different areas and see how long it really takes to load. Because sometimes when you're looking at your own website, you have the patience. You're like, OK, it'll load, it'll get there, and see if it encounters any of those problems like slow loading, bouncing content, or non-responsiveness. So feedback and insights like this were really critical to AMP. And Google came in with this philosophy that AMP shouldn't be developed by a lone player. We really wanted to make sure that AMP was developed by publishers, companies, people, platforms that wanted to use it alike. And so that's really the way that I think it should be done. It should be kind of a group collaborative effort, because we don't want to create something that no one will use or are missing pieces for things that people want. So if you haven't used AMP before, you can try it right now. Just go and search for something like Mars, and you'll probably see that little lightning bolt AMP results, and you can kind of see how the top stories work. We launched this a couple months ago. And the top stories are super cool because they're super fast. Now, what you should do, because most of us probably already have like pretty fast mobile speeds, is you should try and compare this to a regular website on a slower network to really, really see the difference. It is incredible how fast these pages load compared to a normal mobile site nowadays, the average mobile site. When I was in Africa, I was reliant on AMP pages in order to get my news. Chrome Developer Tools actually has the ability to help you throttle connections. So you can do it right now on your laptop and just test on different devices with Chrome Developer Tools and different speeds. So these were the 4 main goals for the AMP project. Obviously, number 1 is make pages fast on mobile. That's the overall goal. The second is to be easy to implement, because we knew that this is a challenging thing for developers. This isn't something where you can just flip a bit and suddenly your page becomes AMP, right? There is some implementation that's required. But overall, I think the payoff is totally worth it. And we tried to make it as easy to implement as possible by working with a lot of different groups, working with a lot of different content management systems to make sure that this AMP could be used in the future. Third, we know that making content isn't free. We wanted to enable monetization, and we didn't want to put any limits on the monetization. We didn't want to say where your ad should be, how dense your ad should be, and we're not raking in any profits from anybody using AMP, right? Because it is an open source community project. All the profit that on your site, even if you're using AMP, goes directly back to the publisher. And finally, we wanted to make a solution that embraces the open web. That's one of the greatest things about the web, that it's open, that it's not locked down to a proprietary platform. And I'm going to echo this sentiment a lot. And I think the Joomla community, the open source Joomla community, will understand that too. We wanted to really collaborate with people and make sure that AMP was useful for everyone. So let's talk about how we went about achieving these goals. When we started looking at it, web pages today, they're really, really different. So let's say on the left, I'm on Gmail, and I'm using email. In the middle, I go and I'm online shopping on Amazon. On the right, I decide to pick up some news on the Washington Post or something. All of these 3 websites are really, really different, and they all deliver 3 different payloads of code. And so when you're thinking about a solution that can kind of take all 3 and put them together, there's not really an obvious solution, right? Because they're just so different in the way that they work. It's like 3 different web apps, basically. So what we started realizing, though, was there was a lot of static leaf pages that were very similar, like blog posts, articles, recipes. These were the things that we could make that were all operating very similarly, but delivering them in different ways. So we wanted to take those static leaf pages and try to run them under one single engine. And that's the key to understanding how AMP works and how it's designed. Because first, it allows us to have across-the-board impact. That means anybody running this AMP engine will be able to get the benefits from AMP, and as it develops, be able to continue to get those benefits from AMP. And the second thing is that it promotes cacheability. So imagine right now if you go to Gmail, Amazon, New York Times, or the Washington Post. It's almost like opening and installing 3 different apps on your phone, right? But after you've installed the app, the second and third time that you use it, it becomes faster, easier to use. And that's kind of the idea. Because it's running on a single engine, we're able to get a lot of efficiency gains based off that concept. So here's the thing to understand about AMP. It's just a web page. AMP HTML is HTML with a couple of restrictions, mostly about JavaScript. And when you're styling your page, it's all about CSS. So these are things that everybody's familiar with. What's really important that there's no one-off JavaScript. And I know everybody's like wondering right now, if there's no one-off JavaScript, what are we going to do about analytics, ads, styling, all these different things, cool things that JavaScript does? And that's where custom elements come into play. So custom elements help you define your analytics, ads. It allows you to style your pages. And a little bit later, I'll go into more depth about how those custom elements work and how they can work for an AMP page and make your page unique and do everything that you need it to do. And finally, we know that sometimes you need to use JavaScript to do something interactive. So you can still run JavaScript. It's just in a sandbox in the AMP iframes. So this engine is built off an open source library called AMP. Again, one of the big efficiency gains is about the high cacheability. An important thing, too, is that it also defines the behaviors for custom elements. So this engine does everything that we need it to, right? So imagine if there's two, let's say the New York Times and the Washington Post both have image carousels. There's no need to have two different implementations of an image carousel, right? Because if we have two different implementations, it slows things down. So we're just trying to bring all these things that are really common into kind of one framework. And most importantly, this engine also manages all the rendering, resource loading, and optimization performances that we'll talk about later. So let's take a look about how AMP page gets from the publisher over to a user. So the first thing to notice is that there is this concept of a validated AMP page. So you need to have an AMP page that is validated, that works within the AMP framework. Once you are able to build this, whether or not you're using a CMS or you have your own custom website and you're building upon it, you can use the AMP HTML as both your mobile and desktop versions. That's totally OK if you want to use that, because it has the ability to do that. But we know a lot of people on desktop prefer to have a more built-out experience for their users. And that's OK, too. As long as you have a link tag from your AMP HTML to your HTML page, we know which ones to serve. So then these pages get cached. And I'll talk a little bit about the AMP cache, because this is actually a big part of the performance gain. And then it gets to a platform like Pinterest, Google, Twitter, Bing's on board now to get to your users. And all that cycles back for your ad revenues, collects all your analytics, and the cycle starts again. And so from here, you can kind of see the mechanisms that make AMP fast. So that AMP HTML format, caching, which I'll talk about in a second, and little tricks we can play because of the way that AMP is built, like pre-rendering within the platform. So first, AMP HTML. It's really fast, but how did it get that way? First off, AMP wasn't built by taking things away, right? We weren't saying, OK, we're going to have to strip out all these things. We're going to have to kill it all. We're going to have to rebuild from the ground up and do something completely different. No. AMP was built and engineered to be fast from the very, very beginning. And so it does a lot of cool things, like asynchronous loading. If you go to an AMP page on a really slow connection, you can see this in action, because it brings in lightweight content, like text, anything that can be loaded first. And then later, as you're going through the web page, it'll bring in all these other elements. So right now, when you're building a web page, you can sort of do this. But JavaScript tends to move things around. Like, that's why we have things that pop around, right? But because of the way that AMP is built, everything is set in a way that we can assume where the content is. And that allows us to do a lot of cool things, like asynchronous loading, without messing up the user experience. The second thing is responsive design is baked in. We've been drilling it into everyone's head. Everyone's site should be responsive. And so that was just a really important aspect of AMP as well. So again, an AMP HTML page can be both your desktop and your mobile page. And finally, it's limited by design. There's just certain limitations, again, to preserve that user experience and in order to give us the best possible ability to load that page as fast as possible. But we tried not to make any really strict restrictions that would be harmful or bad for your website. We still wanted to make sure that your website would be able to be built in a way that you wanted it to be built and configured in a way that you wanted it to be configured. So we bring that all together, and we really elevate that baseline. So I talked about 3 seconds. We're now at 0.7 seconds median load time for an AMP page. Your users won't even have the chance to click back before that content starts loading. And with things like pre-rendering, which I'll talk about in a second, it's even faster. So AMP really has elevated that baseline. We have achieved that goal of making mobile web pages faster. So let's talk a little bit about the caching model. AMP was built inherently with a caching model in mind. And so caching has speed gains because if you bring content closer to your users, it'll be able to serve that content faster. So Google has an AMP cache, which is available free for everyone to use if you want, that has edge servers all around the globe to bring that content faster to our users. And AMP was built with this in mind, which means all AMP pages need to have the ability to be cached. That's a really important part of it. But if you don't want to use the Google AMP cache, you don't have to use it. You can build your own, or you could just not use it at all. The AMP page just needs to be cacheable, but it doesn't mean that everything you're doing, or if you're running a platform, you have to use cache in order to serve AMP. So it's not a restriction. It's merely an option, but it can really speed up the load time of pages. OK, so pre-rendering is actually a really cool thing that we can do because essentially of the way that AMP works. So first off, before you even click a link, a lot of the times we can pre-render what's in that viewport. And the reason that we can do that is because AMP knows where each page or each element in that page is positioned. Again, so we're not bouncing things around. And that way, as you start scrolling, then we can actually start loading things if you actually are looking at it. That's why top stories work so well. If you're swiping around, it's just rendering that viewport initially. But eventually, if you want to go down, then it'll start loading things. It saves on bandwidth. It saves on speed. And it just makes that user experience a lot better. Another inherent thing is that there's no third-party JavaScript, because that third-party JavaScript, again, is what causes a lot of problems in terms of performance, but also in terms of page layout. So without these things kind of messing around with the position, we're able to pre-render content pretty quickly. So together, all these three things are actually the core pieces of what make AMP fast. And as you've seen, a lot of publishers are kind of getting behind AMP. You've probably, if you've ever looked at AMP results, you've seen a lot of big publishers getting on board. Right now, we have hundreds of thousands of domains already publishing in AMP. And this is a growing list. We're really hoping that people catch on to this, are really engaged in this, and are really into the idea of making the mobile web fast. Because this is something that we all need to do together. Again, it's not one person saying, OK, the mobile web needs to be faster. Therefore, on my platform, I'm going to make it fast. Or only my website is going to be fast, right? We need to do this all together in order to make the mobile web usable for a lot of people, including ourselves. And here are a couple examples of platforms supporting AMP. So we have Google, obviously, and Google News. Twitter, so if you're ever in Twitter and you're trying to follow a link, you might see those AMP results. Pinterest does it as well. And recently, I think maybe 2 or 3 months ago, Bing in the iOS and Android app allows you to has AMP results. So that's really cool because a lot of people are seeing the benefits of having this open source platform where everybody can contribute, everybody has a say to build a platform that can make the mobile web fast. So I'd like to spend a couple minutes talking about the focus areas of AMP. These are things that we invested heavily in because we know that these are things that publishers and people who make websites need, right? So you could probably, obviously, we have analytics, ads. Content access is actually a really interesting one because there's a lot of websites nowadays that restrict you from seeing a certain number of articles per week, per month, until you need to log in or subscribe. And we knew that was a very important model for people publishing content. And finally, formatting. When you're thinking about putting things on a single engine in a single place, it might seem like, OK, well, then every page is going to be the same. Everything's going to be the same. Where can I be unique? Where can I really make my website better than other people? And that's why we're investing a lot of time in formatting. So first off is analytics in AMP. So the philosophy is measure once, report to many. Because right now we know there are a lot of people who use many different analytics platforms on their website. And that requires multiple lines of JavaScript. That requires these packages picking up basically the same signals and reporting it back to these analytics platforms. And there's really no need to do that because we're all essentially measuring the same thing. So we worked really hard with a lot of people who build analytics packages to measure everything that they need and send it back to those analytic packages. So that's actually one of the biggest things about AMP with analytics that I think has really, really improved the performance. The second thing is ads. So as I referenced earlier, there's no restriction on the ads. You can make it as dense as you want. You can make it as sparse as you want. You know what's best for your users. You've experimented around with it. You've placed ads on your pages for a very long time. So we didn't want to restrict how these ads were going. And we've partnered with a lot of the huge ad companies so that every single ad, hopefully every single ad company is represented in AMP ads. And if they're not, there's a way for them to kind of put their code into the repository if you go to the AMP GitHub. So content access, again, is really important, right? Because we didn't want to restrict the way that people gave people access to their content. That's really important for a lot of websites. So being able to log in, being able to say, OK, you can only read 5 articles a month or something, is really important for a lot of publishers. And we wanted to make sure that was well represented when building a website on AMP. And then finally is the format innovations in AMP. So there's a lot of cool things that we've already built out. The image carousel, light boxes, AMP sidebars, AMP lists, accordions. We're trying to build as much content here as possible because that way you can really customize your site. And one of the most exciting things that we just released, I would say maybe like a week ago now, is AMP forms. And within AMP forms, you can do really cool things. Like, let's say you have a product and you want to choose the color. You can, in AMP, allow people to choose colors for a product. Or if you want people to sign up for your newsletter, you can get them to sign up in the newsletter using AMP forms. And there's an entire roadmap for AMP, right? It's not a mystery what's going to happen. If you want to look at the roadmap, you can just go to the ampproject.org/docs. And so this is kind of like the resource page if you're interested in joining the AMP initiative. If you're a publisher, I would encourage you to take a look at the GitHub repository, see if you want to contribute, because I think it's a really exciting project. You can come talk to me to get a little bit more information. If you're a publisher and you're making websites, just put up your own Hello World site. And I know there's been sessions about A/B testing. You can A/B test your sites on AMP just to see if there are those performance gains. And in fact, if you go to ampproject.org, you'll see a lot of data backing up that pages using AMP right now are bringing in more users, getting users to stay around, getting users to come back, because users do see those performance gains and they like it. They like that speed. They like being able to see their content as soon as possible. And so we still have a lot to do in the AMP journey. It's been a little bit more than a year, and I think we've come a long way, but we really need your help. We really need your feedback. We really need you to try out AMP and just give us that feedback and see how we can improve it, because together we can still improve it. It's not a closed system. It's an open system for everybody that has that publishes websites to come together and build. OK, let's switch gears a little bit. I'm going to talk about security. I know we had a session earlier today about security, but this is something that I'm really passionate about, and as Dre has emphasized this morning, is just so important. I'll give you a stat. So I think Dre said there was 38% of their sites they saw were for SEO poisoning. Last year, from 2015 to 2016, as we were going from 2015 to 2016, we measured internally at Google our spam rate, and we were looking at which type of spam has increased the most. And hacked websites were number one. It was an 180% gain. And that's really, really scary, because people are starting to realize, OK, if I can't game the system by manipulating algorithms, I'm just going to start hacking sites, right? That's how I'm going to game the system. They're shifting their strategy. And that means your sites are as vulnerable as ever. And if you don't think that your sites are vulnerable, just take a look at your log files. Someone said what they thought about obscurity, security through obscurity. So I put up a website a couple weeks ago. I was just playing around kind of with new tools and stuff. I had a no index tag on it. No one should have known this site existed. But a couple days later, I was checking the log files, and I was already getting attacks to it. And it baffled me. It baffled me how they found it. And then finally, I talked to one of my friends who was like more versed in security, and she said, hey, it's probably because they were looking at new sites that have been registered or new domain names that have been registered, and they're just hitting it. They're just hitting it to see if there's any type of vulnerability out there. So it is really, really scary out there. You will be attacked if you have a website. Hopefully those attacks aren't successful, but there's a lot of ways to mitigate against it and minimize that chance of being attacked. The second thing is detection is becoming increasingly difficult. Dre also referenced this, botnets, credit card skimming. A lot of the times the credit card skimmers, 1 or 2 lines of JavaScript that are obfuscated on an entire page that you probably have a bunch of JavaScript on, right? And JavaScript that you're probably not familiar with. And so if you see this jumble of letters and text, it doesn't really stand out. But if you actually decode it and see what it does, and you just take the time to decode that JavaScript, you'll see that it's stealing your credit cards, it's redirecting your users, it's doing all these nefarious things. And again, botnets, they'll linger on your site for months. We saw one botnet that lingered on people's sites for about 6 months before they started putting out attacks. And they were taking people's reputation and sending a whole bunch of spammy emails. And people didn't even realize this was happening. This was happening on a scale of tens of millions of emails. And so detection is becoming really, really hard. But that just means that prevention is key. You need to focus on prevention. You need to focus on security. And they're really, really basic things, like keeping up with security alerts and updates. Don't think that, OK, I'm going to leave a vulnerability on my website. It's all right. It's not a big deal. No one will probably see this. There's billions of websites in the world, right? That's definitely not the case. With the ability of hackers to use computing power to basically crawl the web and attack as many sites as they can, it is a real possibility that if you have a vulnerability on your site, you will be attacked. And we've talked to a lot of people, and a lot of people tell me, I knew this vulnerability was on my site. And that baffles me, right? I'm like, OK, you know that vulnerability was on your site, but you didn't do anything. And I ask them, why didn't you do anything? And they tell me, oh, it's because my client didn't want to do anything. I told my client that this was an outdated plugin, that no one supports it anymore, but it does like this one function that they really like. It puts pictures on their site in some way that they really enjoy, and they don't want to do anything about it. And that's why I think when you're talking with clients, if you're building websites for people, it is super important to emphasize security is of the utmost importance. And tell them that if they don't have these if they don't focus on security, their own reputation will be tarnished. Because people trying to go to their websites will be directed to pharma, they'll be redirected to porn, they'll be redirected to nefarious things, malware, and that's a really big hit on any type of website, right? It really tarnishes your reputation. So emphasize with clients when you're working with people that security is super important and that you can't keep plugins that are outdated just because you like the functionality. So HTTPS, how many people have HTTPS-enabled websites? OK, that's awesome. I was thinking that it would be a smaller number. So you don't need me to emphasize how important HTTPS is. I could go on for an entire other presentation about HTTPS. But it's important for both you and your users. And even if you don't think that it's super important for yourself right now, just think about the future web technologies that you can use. Because all those will be reliant on HTTPS. Like, for example, if you want to do push notifications, or you want to get the location information of someone on a website, that requires your site to be HTTPS enabled. And the future will be about HTTPS. Everybody is gearing towards this. The whole industry is gearing towards HTTPS. So it's very, very important. So plan ahead. Make sure that every site you build has kind of that plan to get to HTTPS. And as if you needed extra encouragement, so I think in 2014, 2015, Google said there would be a slight ranking boost for HTTPS. In January 17th, Chrome will start notifying all sites that HTTP pages that collect passwords or credit cards will be marked as non-secure. So if you have anything that collects credit cards or passwords, first off, you probably shouldn't be using HTTP for those. But if you really need that extra incentive, January 17th is kind of your deadline, at least if most of your users use Chrome, and hopefully they do. So there's a lot of things that I could talk about. I just want to give you a couple really quick tips. So first off is prioritize security. The talk in this morning talked about it. I'm going to talk about it. Make sure security is a priority. It's no longer a thing that you can think about secondary when developing your website. It's as important as content creation. It's as important as going mobile. Deprecate any unsupported and unneeded software. I see this a lot. For some reason, people really like keeping around plugins that they don't use anymore. It's kind of like just cleaning your code base. Just every once in a while, audit what you're doing and clean out the cruft, the stuff that you don't need. Because allowing any attack vectors, even if there's no security vulnerabilities at the moment, if you're not using it, you should probably just get rid of it because there might be a security vulnerability in the future, and that just minimizes your risk. Consider using security plugins or services to protect your site. We had an anecdote earlier today that someone's site was saved a couple of times by these types of attacks. And again, it's really hard to detect nowadays. So it can be very difficult for you, if you're not well-versed in security, to go through your site every day and check things, right? And so if you're running a site that has a lot of risk, or you're running a site that collects a lot of passwords or credit cards, this is something that you should strongly consider. Enable two-factor authentication. So your site's not always going to be attacked because of vulnerabilities on your website per se. Phishing emails, right? So in the recent US elections, there was a lot of leaks of emails, and one of the reasons that happened was from a phishing email. Now, if you have two-factor authentication, even if someone gets your password, that kind of mitigates the ability for someone to get into any of your content. So wherever you have the ability to enable two-factor authentication, please use it. I know it's a little bit painful. Believe me, sometimes I'm always like, why do I have to check my phone just to log in again? But it's super, super worth it because it gives you that peace of mind. Test your site on mobile. This is a basic piece of advice that you give people when you're developing websites, right? But the name of the game for a lot of people who compromise websites is to stay on your website as long as possible. So there are things like cloaking. But now people are kind of more aware of cloaking. You can use Google Search Console, formerly Google Webmaster Tools, to see how Google sees your websites versus how users use your website, right? And now people are just saying, OK, I'm only going to attack people on mobile, right? And using specific mobile devices or using specific geolocations. So you have to test your site constantly on mobile just to make sure that there's nothing nefarious going on. It also helps you get a better perspective of how your site operates on mobile. So I think that's a win-win situation. Also important is to pay attention to what your users are saying. If your users are saying, I'm constantly getting redirected for some reason, you really have to investigate on that. Make sure to get their information, their geolocation information, the device they're using, any type of information that can help you track down the source of the compromise. It may be on their phone, it may be on your website, so you just need to collect as much information as possible. I've already mentioned this, but put together a plan to migrate to HTTPS. I know it can take time for certain websites, but it's super, super important. And finally, register your site in Google Search Console. So we've seen a 180% increase in the amount of hacked sites, and we've notified every single one of them. And we continue to try to notify people as much as possible. And a lot of those notifications come through Google Search Console. So if you register your site in Google Search Console, make sure those critical emails are enabled to an email that you're actually checking. That way you can get any type of alerts once Google sees it. Some people tell me that Google might send too many alerts. If you think that's the case, please come talk to me, and we can talk about ways that maybe we can improve Google Search Console so it's not inundating you with things that you don't find useful, because we want to make sure only those really important critical things come through to you as a web developer. So here's some resources. We have ampproject.org. Google.com/webmasters is our help center content. It contains almost everything you need. And then we have social channels on Google Webmasters and on Twitter, Google WMC, where we post new content, anything we put out on our blogs, or anything important that we think web developers or people who work on the web should use. And finally, I think you should, if you have any more questions, please come talk to me. I'll be around for the rest of the conference. I'm happy to talk about AMP, happy to talk about security, but I'm also happy to talk about just generally how your site performs in search, or if there's ways that we can be better in telling you about certain features in search. So with that, I think I'll let everybody go to lunch. I know everyone is hungry, so thanks so much.